morass of complex legal decisions that go on in the FDA to regulate products. It's been a pleasure to understand that and to be able to interpret it in terms of our research. He has taken his research and his work on exposure and the constituents of tobacco and tobacco smoke for many years. He was the Public Health Service rank of Assistant Surgeon General of the United States, currently serves on the World Health Organization Study Group for Tobacco Product Regulation, and before that was chair of the WHO Tobacco Laboratory Network. So he has a lot to say and a lot of wisdom, and I hope we'll have a lot of great questions. Thank you, David.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the invitation to talk. When I left FDA, one of the things I really wanted to do was to do this, to go and to meet with people who are trying to move research on tobacco issues forward and that have a lot of questions for FDA that FDA was not allowed to answer. Well, now I'm not at FDA anymore, so I can try to answer those questions. And I will try as much as I can. Obviously, I haven't been at FDA for 3 years, but I track them very well. I still know most of the people there. So what I'm trying to do is to give you kind of look behind the curtain. So this is how FDA thinks about issues. This is how they work on issues. And hopefully it'll help you when you're designing your research in ways that can actually be, the results can be better to inform FDA and help FDA actually do what they're trying to do. So that's my purpose. Mary Ann, thanks a lot for the introduction. I spent 27 years at CDC. I spent 7 years at FDA. A lot of those years were working on tobacco. I first started really getting into tobacco products in 1996. And so I've spent a lot of time looking at these things. So hopefully what I have to do will be interesting. Now, it changed. All right. Since leaving federal service about 4 years ago, I have, as Mary Ann said, I'm a research professor at Georgia State. I also have worked as an independent contractor, going back to my old lab at CDC. So I've done that, independent contracting. I've worked a lot with the WHO and have really enjoyed that, not just now, but I've done that for probably 30 years. I also did some work as a special government employee of the FDA even after I left. And I have done some work with Pfizer. They've had some issues. They've asked me to come in and give some presentation. I do not speak for I don't speak for FDA. So anything I say is my own view. Don't take it as what FDA is saying now. But again, I will try to give you as much insight into what FDA, how it works as I can. My objectives are to try to provide a background on FDA CTP regulation to help people to understand a little bit about how FDA really regulates tobacco products. I'm going to talk about the process of regulatory decision-making and how science fits into that. How does science influence tobacco regulatory decisions as they're made? And then hopefully, and then also I'm going to give some examples of how science influences tobacco regulatory decisions, including the recent FDA IQOS PMTA decision. And I will try to explain that a little bit. If you've got questions, please hold on to them. If you can just write down the slide number, we'll go back to slides. I'm going to try to get through this. If I stop for questions, we won't get through it all. So I'm going to try to get through it, go back, and I'll be glad to answer any questions that I can answer. So in 2009, CTP got authority to regulate tobacco products. Now, the products are made or derived from tobacco intended for human consumption, and that is the statutory language, made or derived from tobacco. So different countries around the world have different definitions, but I like this definition because even if there's no tobacco involved, like in e-cigarettes where it's been extracted, you can still have regulatory authority. And in 2009, there was immediate regulatory authority for the manufacture, marketing, and distribution of cigarettes, cigarette tobacco, roll your own tobacco, and smokeless tobacco. So there's several things that are not on this list. Cigars aren't on the list. Cigars at that time were just kind of, weren't considered to be a big issue to be dealt with. And obviously e-cigarettes are not on there, but in 2009, e-cigarettes really weren't on anybody's radar. Nobody really thought about that. So there are some things that are not on the list, but has been addressed. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So FDA was given certain authority in the Tobacco Control Act. They were given authority to gather knowledge, to go out and obtain information on the regulated products, to require the companies to provide information to FDA. They were given authority to do product review, and this is defined as to restrict product changes to protect public health, and also to prohibit modified risk claims that state or imply reduced exposure or reduced risk without an order. So knowledge gathering, product review. They're also given authority to develop product standards and product standards to restrict marketing and distribution to protect public health and to decrease the harms of tobacco products. I'll talk about those two subjects in a lot more detail as we go. They're also given the authority for compliance and enforcement, and compliance and enforcement is basically those are the folks that go out and make sure the laws are being followed. So to ensure industry compliance with FDA regulation. Given explicit authority to do public education, to educate the public about the harms of tobacco use and FDA's regulatory actions. And it's actually a little bit unusual. FDA doesn't do a lot of public education. CDC, where I spent 27 years, is all about educating the public and communicating. FDA is not about that at all. So that authority, that explicit authority given in the Tobacco Control Act was really helpful because public education is a really big part of tobacco control. And then express authority to do research, to expand the science base for regulatory action. And again, that was very helpful. When I got there as the director of the Office of Science, it was clear we needed to do some good research to get the information needed to make good regulatory decisions. So the Tobacco Control Act created a new standard that we call the Population Health Standard. And in the statute is defined as appropriate for the protection of public health, considering, and then it's the risk and benefits to the population as a whole, and then the likelihood of cessation and the likelihood of initiation. And this was really a very good standard. When you're dealing with consumer products versus drugs or food, well, versus drugs particularly, you need to understand the impact not on just users, but on non-users. So including in this definition, cessation and initiation was a really, really critical and important step in making this law actually able to have an impact. So it's not just the risk of using the product, it also includes starting and stopping. And this is not the same as the safety and efficacy standard that most of the rest of FDA uses. We're going to hear it. You probably are hearing a lot about safety and efficacy. I've heard more about safety and efficacy in the past 3 months than I've heard, except at FDA, my entire lifetime, because they're talking about these the COVID-19 vaccines and safety and efficacy. I'm sure the U.S. public never even heard safety and efficacy before, but now we're hearing it all the time. But that's the normal standard at FDA, but the Center for Tobacco Products has this appropriate for the protection of public health standard. Now let me explain one other thing just to make sure it is clear. So there's two ways that FDA brings about direction for industry. The first of those are rules and regulations. And rules and regulations are delegated authority to enforce primary legislation. The primary legislation is the Tobacco Control Act. That is the thing that was passed by Congress, signed by the president, and went into force. But in a lot of cases, the Tobacco Control Act describes things like in this text here, where it says, after notice and opportunity for comment, there are things that are required in regulations which shall be issued by the secretary. So FDA has to issue regulations that will basically explain and describe what that law means and how that law is to be enforced. And so that is rules and regulations. When rules and regulations go into effect, they have the authority of law. When people don't follow rules and regulations, they are fined, they are imprisoned, there are penalties to pay. So that's rules and regulations. The problem with rules and regulations is it is really, really slow. It takes a long time. There are a lot of steps involved in putting together a rule or regulation. So these are the steps involved in putting together the draft rule. And the draft rule is just the thing that's going to go out for public comment. So all these steps are followed as FDA goes through that process. Then there's the steps for the final rule, which again has lots and lots of steps. This process in these two columns is maybe 3 to 4 to 5 years long work. And then after it's actually enforced, after actually it comes out, then there's implementation. In implementation, there's a particular time. So for deeming, for example, implementation was 90 days. For product standards, the law says it's 1 to 3 years after the product final rule is finalized. And then you have lawsuits, and you have dozens of lawsuits. FDA is still dealing with lawsuits related to deeming, which occurred in 2016. They're still in process of dealing with those lawsuits. So developing regulations and rules is a long, drawn-out process. On the other hand, guidance can be very quick. Guidance is something that FDA can put out very quickly. It can go out in stages, but FDA can just issue a guidance very quickly. The problem is guidance is not law. Guidance is not like a law and cannot be enforced. It explains FDA's thinking when it's finalized. It doesn't require that notice and comment rulemaking, so it doesn't involve all those steps from that previous slide. But it describes how regulated industry could comply with the law, but allows for alternatives. But this is a way that FDA communicates out to industry, here's what we're thinking, which to a large degree is telling industry, this is what we would like you to do. Now, again, industry has options. They can try other things, but this is one way that FDA communicates to industry what they think they should do. So if you are interested in how to do the best kind of research, reading these guidances and understanding them is actually a really important step, because it tells you what FDA is thinking, what FDA is going to be looking for, how FDA is going to be evaluating the science around a lot of these questions. So in the Tobacco Control Act, FDA was also given the authority to deem other products to be under this regulatory authority. Remember, I said a minute ago, cigarettes, cigarette tobacco, roll your own tobacco, and smokeless tobacco were under FDA's original authority, but they're given specific language that says that they are allowed to, by regulation, deem other products to be under. And so in 2016, FDA deemed other products to be under their regulatory authority. And this is actually what the deeming regulation looks like. It went into effect on May 10th, 2016. It includes nicotine, it includes dissolvables, gels, pipe tobacco, water tobacco. And then it was also very broad to include anything else that meets the definition of a tobacco product. And so this was very wide expansion of the products that came under FDA's regulatory authority. Originally, the rule was actually related to flavored little cigars. When we first started writing the deeming rule, it was all about flavored little cigars, which had begun to grow in prevalence. Once FDA passed the regulation that eliminated flavors in cigarettes, then companies started putting out all these flavored little cigars. And FDA realized we've got to deal with this flavored little cigar issue. And so started to write the deeming rule around flavored little cigars. During that time and that process, e-cigarettes began to rise up in use and become more prevalent. And so the law, which was intended for little flavored cigars, ended up being basically the e-cigarette law, but that's not what it was originally. So in September 2020, let me go back. So as of August 8th, 2016, all newly deemed products that were not grandfathered, meaning they were not on the market on February 15th, 2007, were not legal to be marketed. So if they were on the market on February 15th, 2007, they could remain on the market, but if they were introduced or changed since that day, they were illegal to be marketed. FDA issued enforcement discretion in the form of a guidance to allow these products to remain on the market in order to give manufacturers time to develop the science to support applications that they could put in. So as of right now, all those products, all those newly deemed products on the market are all illegal. They are not legally allowed on the market. They're only allowed on the market because of FDA enforcement discretion, because FDA has decided not to enforce that parts of the law. September 2020, all newly deemed products that were not grandfathered were required to submit a marketing application or be removed from the market. And FDA has already started the review of those newly deemed products. So applications have come into FDA, and FDA is starting to the review of all those newly deemed products. But it's just a really important thing to understand that the only reason these products are on the market is because FDA issued a guidance allowing that. So FDA can withdraw that guidance or parts of that guidance at any time to remove those products. And that's what they did. Oh, I guess it's been almost 2 years ago. Maybe it was just a year ago. I'm losing track of time with COVID, where they started to address flavored e-cigarettes with cartridges. And so they simply issued a guidance, and they could do that because already those products were illegal. So we've got product review. And product review are one-by-one product decisions. They're not broad decisions over all e-cigarettes. They're individual decisions about individual tobacco products. The good thing about it is the evidentiary burden for product review is on the applicant. The applicant has to prove that this product should be on the market and should be authorized. So that's a huge advantage. As of June 2019, which are the last numbers I have, FDA had removed from the market or prevented from being marketed 2,697 new tobacco products. I don't think many people are aware that FDA has done this. When I was there, we were reviewing and rejecting thousands of products as they were going along, wide array of products. So FDA has taken a lot of regulatory action through product review. But then there's the other side, which is product standards. The big advantage of product standards is they can apply to all products or groups of products. So you can make a product standard, it can be very broad, not just a one-by-one individual product. The problem with product standards and what makes it hard is the evidentiary burden is on FDA. FDA has to prove that the science supports that, in this case, different from the product review requirement. As of October 2019, FDA had issued a final and then reissued a proposed product standard for graphic health warnings on cigarette packaging and advertising. And they've also issued a proposed rule for N-nitroso-nornicotine in smokeless tobacco. So those two product standards are out there in process. Let me talk a little bit about product review. So product review includes investigational tobacco products. It includes new product review. It includes substantial equivalence. It includes exemption from substantial equivalence and modified risk tobacco product applications. As I said before, the applicant must provide the adequate evidence for FDA to make the finding. The evidentiary burden is on the applicant, it's not on FDA. But FDA uses scientific research to evaluate the evidence that's provided by the applicant. FDA doesn't just take whatever the applicant says and take it for what it is. FDA actually evaluates that and bases their decision on research that's done by others on these issues. So in dealing with product review, there's some very interesting questions, and there are different questions that have to be answered when you're looking at product for review. So for new product applications, the question is the marketing of a new product appropriate for the protection of public health? When FDA first started in this process, that term, appropriate for the protection of public health, was not defined anywhere. It defined any more than have those 3 different bullets. So what does appropriate protection of public health mean? It could mean that the products simply were not any more dangerous than other products, Or it could mean that those products, if they're introduced onto the market, have to help solve the public health problem that is caused by tobacco products. And that's the definition that we came up with when I was at FDA. Appropriate for the protection of public health means that introducing a new product, the companies have to demonstrate that that will be an improvement in public health. With nearly 500,000 Americans dying every year, maintaining that is not appropriate for the protection of public health. So introducing a new product has to reduce that public health burden. So that was the first big question. A second big question had to do with substantial equivalent, and that is different questions of public health. Now, when the industry had their influence on Congress and got this language into the statute, the way the industry understood this to mean was different questions of public health would be things that had never happened before, new diseases, new effects. And that's what they thought. So they thought they could continue to basically put more and more cigarettes on the market and ignore any kind of public health impact. But FDA's interpretation of these words were that if any product is more dangerous, more harmful than any other product that's on the market, then that product raises different questions of public health and will not be allowed on the market. So the folks at Philip Morris didn't like this interpretation at all. And we got a lot of criticism and fighting for this. But FDA so far has been able to stick with that definition that if the product in any way is more harmful than current products, it cannot get a substantial equivalence determination. MRTP has some very interesting phrases. One of those is as it is actually used by consumers, and the other is benefit the health of the population as a whole. So when you look at as it is actually used by consumers, the question is that as it is actually intended by the company to be used by consumers, or is it is actually used by consumers when they decide they're going to use it not as the company suggested? And right now, FDA's definition is misuse of the product, abuse of the product is included in actually used by consumers. It's not just as the company intended to be used, it's as people actually use it. Then the second was benefiting the health of the population as a whole. And that is dealing with everybody. It's not just smokers. It is dealing with non-smokers and others who may be impacted based on the Tobacco Control Act. And so when you start looking at authorization decisions, there are a lot of populations that you have to address. You have to look at current smokers for sure. Current smokers are an important part of the whole equation. What will be the impact of introducing a new product on current smokers? But you also have to look at people that are poly users or dual users, people that are using more than one product. What does that mean as part of the equation? You look at adult non-users, people who may have never used a tobacco product, who the introduction of this product may bring adult non-users into product use, and youth and adolescents who may also be encouraged to use the product. So there are a lot of factors that go into all of these authorization decisions, and there are a lot of different populations that you have to look at and consider as you're making those decisions. Now, product review is primarily around morbidity and mortality. That is it. What FDA would really like to have is good data on if we introduce this product on the market, this will be its effect on morbidity and mortality. Unfortunately, that data is really not there. People are not going to be able to really give you that kind of data. What comes instead is information on the materials, the ingredients, the design, the composition, constituents, other features, and marketing. That is the data that is provided by the industry. And so somehow you have to get from what's on the column on the left to the column on the right, because you've got to connect these two and understand how does changing the ingredients going to affect morbidity? How is changing the constituents going to affect mortality? And the way that's done is looking at the pathways from the characteristics to morbidity and mortality. And that occurs through the appeal of the product, addictiveness, use behavior, exposure to chemicals in the product, the pharmacokinetics of how the products are being taken into the body, toxicity, toxicology, people's perception of the product, and rates of initiation, rates of cessation. So what FDA does is they have that information on the left. They do experimental studies to understand those things in the middle and then project what's going to be the public health impact over there on the right. So let me give you an example. Let me talk about IQOS a little bit. And you guys may probably very familiar with this, so I'll go through a lot of it quickly. But modern heated tobacco products utilize electrical heating elements designed to avoid burning of tobacco, minimize release of hazardous combustion products commonly found in cigarette smoke while still delivering nicotine. They can also heat tobacco using other sources like ignitable carbon tips. Contemporary heated tobacco products operate below 350. Conventional cigarettes operate at about 800 degrees. All heated tobacco product systems include an insert containing processed tobacco and some means of heating that tobacco. Heated tobacco products are nothing new. They've been around for a long time. They were actually first introduced in 1988. And between then and now, they have come and gone. They've been introduced. They've been taken from the market. They've been turned over for a long time. So recent years have seen the introduction of a large variety of these products, a lot of in the Western Pacific region of the world, but some in the United States. And primarily 4 different types of heated tobacco products. And the 4 types are here, but they vary depending on the heating source and the way the tobacco is introduced into the device. And so you've got, in the US, we are not generally looking at all those different varieties, but around the world, all those varieties exist. There's the interesting ones, which are iFuse and Plume Tech, which are hybrid e-cigarettes and cigarettes, where they heat up a e-cigarette liquid, and then that e-cigarette aerosol moves through tobacco and extracts the nicotine, which then is breathed by the user. So 4 different kinds of HTPs around in the world today. Studies to date indicate that HTPs are less attractive than conventional cigarettes. We're allowed, not in the US, but in other countries, flavors are an important factor in appeal. Around the world, there are lots of flavors in their heated tobacco products, and that's a big factor. Other factors in the appeal include the price, whether it's more or less expensive than cigarettes, the high-tech appearance, the youth orientation of marketing, the personal attention. And one of the things we have learned with the IQOS introduction in Atlanta is they treat each customer as a friend, as they spend time with them, they call them, they try to meet with them to have dinner. They work really hard on each individual customer because they know that if they can start customers liking their product, then those customers by word of mouth will spread this out. And so there's a lot of personal attention. So if you ever get the chance to go into an IQOS store, that salesman's going to become your best friend, and they're going to spend lots of time with you, answer all your questions. And again, in the US, they'll invite you to dinner, they'll invite you out for drinks. They will really try to figure out how to make you a longtime user of the product. And then claims of lower risk are also a very big issue. As far as addictiveness is concerned, nicotine delivery from some HTPs is similar to conventional cigarettes. So IQOS delivers about 75% of the nicotine delivered by a commercial cigarette. That's pretty good. The other HTPs deliver a lot less. They're not as effective in getting that nicotine to the user. For some HTPs, nicotine pharmacokinetics is similar to conventional cigarettes. So abuse liability is probably similar to conventional cigarettes. It's not quite there, but it's similar. The companies, I'm sure, are still working on trying to get that delivery faster than what they would, what it is right now. As far as emissions are concerned, generally the emissions are lower levels of toxic chemicals compared to conventional cigarettes, but some of those emissions are higher than found in e-cigarettes. Emissions can rise when the product is not properly cleaned after each use. And so that's another factor in actually used by consumers that I didn't see any data on when Philip Morris came before FDA. As the operating temperature rises, even below 200 degrees, the levels of HPHCs rise substantially. So it's not just when it gets to 350, it's all zero. Actually, between 200 and 350, the levels are rising over that period. There's a lot more humectants in the emissions, and aldehydes, which are generated from humectants, are lower than in cigarettes, but they are very high and of concern. Other emissions or other HCs of concern that have not been previously evaluated in the smoke of conventional cigarettes. In the PMI's ICOS PMTA application, they noted 80 constituents that were either elevated in ICOS aerosol or not found in conventional cigarette smoke. So far, we don't know the implications of that finding, whether that is a major risk source or not. The research is not really there yet to understand that. As far as toxicology is concerned, studied by the industry reports lower in vitro cytotoxicity and mutagenicity. The industry also reports decreased toxicity and carcinogenicity in animal studies. There's been a single independent study, and they found arterial flow mediated filtration was comparable between exposure to ICOS and conventional cigarette smokes, but the toxicology studies on ICOS are very limited. Almost all of it is coming from the industry. There's almost nothing that's coming from independent researchers. Biomarkers of exposure with complete switching from smoking to ICOS is much lower. So that is, I think that's pretty clear data that if you completely switch from smoking to ICOS, your biomarker exposure is going to go down. But we know that many, if not most, ICOS users are dual users. So this is some data from Korea, and there was 96.25% of the adult HTP users in Korea were also conventional cigarette smokers. So there were very, very few exclusive ICOS users in Korea. In Japan, 63% of HTP users were also conventional cigarette smokers. And these are not just occasional cigarette smokers. These are daily cigarette smokers. Again, in Japan, 94.4% of the dual users of HTP and cigarettes, which again is the predominant use behavior, were daily smokers. So these are not people that are smoking occasionally. These are daily smokers. And so most of the people that are using, at least in Japan and Korea, that are using e-cigarettes are daily smokers who are dual users with ICOS. Now, what we really want to know is what the biomarkers of exposure are in this case. What are our biomarkers with these dual users? Unfortunately, there's no independent studies yet that I've been able to find that have found biomarkers of exposure of people who are dual using HTPs and cigarettes. The best we can do is look at e-cigarettes, which are another reduced exposure product where a lot of people are dual users. And we found very clearly that if you are a complete switcher to e-cigarettes, your exposure to biomarkers goes very far down. But if you're a dual user, you have pretty much the same exposure as you have to smoking cigarettes only. So these dual users, there's no real indication that dual use is any benefit whatsoever versus smoking by itself. So health outcomes, there's very limited studies on health outcomes, but there are some potential concerns, including the high nicotine intake, maintaining addiction, cardiovascular disease, chronic respiratory disease, and effects in pregnant women and children. So there's still some concerns, but we've got very little data on health outcomes. So in spite of all of this, FDA did grant new product and modified risk exposure claim authorizations. When they granted these authorizations, they placed requirements for post-marketing studies on ICOS, including requirements to determine whether dual use is a period of transition between smoking and exclusive ICOS use, or is it a long-term use behavior? Those are very different matters. If dual use is simply people moving from cigarettes to exclusive HTP use, that's one thing. If it's going to be long-term dual use, that is something completely different, and the whole appropriate for protection of public health paradigm changes in those two cases. It's really extremely important that there be some good independent studies to evaluate use behavior of ICOS in the real world, evaluate appeal to adolescents and the health risk under real world use conditions, not under conditions where it's pristine, It is not got char in it. It's being smoked one time. Another anecdotal note I have of someone who I know at CDC who was an ICOS user is after they smoked one of these heat sticks, they will then take it out, turn it 90 degrees, put it back in and smoke it again. They could actually get twice the nicotine out by smoking it a second time. So how do people really use these products, and what are the biomarkers, what are the health effects under real use conditions as required by the statute? Okay, so we're going to switch from product review. And now I'm going to talk about product standards a little bit. So product standards are defined in the statute, and it says through rulemaking, FDA can adopt product standards. And it can do it for nicotine yields, for the reduction or elimination of constituents, for construction components, ingredients, provisions for testing or measuring, restrictions on sale and distribution, and the form and content of labeling for the proper use of tobacco products. One of the great things about product standards is they're very broad. FDA can look at a lot of different issues and make decisions about applying product standards, but they're product standards, which means it's a slow, drawn out process. It's a years-long process to get this through. And on top of everything else, as I said earlier, the evidentiary burden for product standards rests on FDA. FDA has to provide the data to prove that this product standard meets the requirements of the statute. And so they need that research to be done that substantiates everything around the product standard. So there are certain limits on product standards, but they're very small. Let me see if I can go back. So there is a limit that FDA can't ban all cigarettes, all smokeless tobacco products, all little cigars, all cigars other than little cigars, all pipe tobacco, or all roll your own tobacco products. Notice that e-cigarettes are not in that list because e-cigarettes really didn't exist at the time the statute was written. And so FDA could theoretically ban all e-cigarettes. The other part of that is that FDA cannot require the reduction of nicotine yields of a tobacco product to 0. But that doesn't say they can't force it to be dropped really low. It just can't go to 0. Now, once a standard is in place, FDA has got to be able to answer certain questions that are going to be posed. And these questions are all around, does a specific marketed product meet the standard or not meet the standard? So to answer those questions, a standard should be justifiable, it should be necessary, it should be appropriate, it should be unambiguous, it should be measurable, and it should be quantifiable. And all of this is around, does an individual product meet or not meet the standard? Is that product on the market legally or not on the market legally? So there are a bunch of different pieces to this that have to be answered as FDA is developing a product standard. So I'm gonna give you an example, and we'll talk through an example here. Product standard I'm gonna talk about is related to tobacco-specific nitrosamines. And they're known carcinogens. They're some of the primary causes of cancer found in cigarette smoke. All other things remaining the same, if you get the tobacco-specific nitrosamines out of tobacco, that would reduce the risk of cancer from tobacco use. But there's several questions to address as it's developing this product standard. And this is one of those. So this is the levels of tobacco-specific nitrosamines in different types of tobacco. Now this is actually smoke, it's tobacco smoke, but it answers the same question. So the amount of nitrosamines coming from burley tobacco and from bright tobacco are very different. And I'll blow that up a little bit. And you can see, for example, in nitrosamine or nicotine in burley tobacco is very high, and it is very low in bright tobacco. So compared to bright tobacco, burley tobacco has much higher levels of nitrosamines. And those are not small variations. Those are really big variations. So the choice of tobacco used in a tobacco product is one of the significant determinants of levels to which users are exposed. In addition to tobacco type, there are other factors that impact levels: growing conditions, the curing process, the production process, pasteurization or heat treatment, and storage. All of those impact the amount of nitrosamines that are in the final product that are being consumed by the user. All that's explained. There are large differences in nitrosamines in U.S. smokeless tobacco products, particularly around, there's also differences between certain types of tobacco products like loose leaf and twist and snus, which has much lower levels of nitrosamines than other types. But even snus varies between the US and Sweden. So in Sweden, the levels of snus are much lower than the levels in the US. Because of the way snus is manufactured in Sweden under strict conditions, it causes it to have lower levels. So there's a substantially lower level of esophageal cancer in Sweden compared to the US. And a particular question that arose during the rule development was the scope of the rule. Should the rule set standards for NNN and NNK both, or one or the other, based on their impact on cancer from smokeless tobacco? And so these first slides I was showing you really are establishing that it is possible to have products that meet the standard, and it is possible for products that don't meet the standard to be changed to meet the standard, and that there is health effects that are due to the use of this product. A lot of those are those things I had in that list a few slides ago. But one of the questions is, what's the scope? How broad should this be? And how broad does the science support how big it should be? And this is a slide from Irina Stepanov that was given at the 2017 annual meeting of SRNT. And the left graph shows the adjusted odd ratios of developing lung or esophageal cancer in tertiles of urinary NNAL, which is a biomarker of NNK exposure. There's dose-response relationship with, but the adjusted odds ratio for esophageal cancer are 1 for all 3 urinary NNAL concentrations. So for NNK exposure, NNK is linked to lung cancer. As the amount of NNK goes up, as the amount of biomarker for NNK goes up, lung cancer odds ratio goes up. In contrast, you saw on the right, you see for NNN, a dose-response relationship of the adjusted odds ratio for developing lung cancer and esophageal cancer in tertiles for urinary NNN. And you see the opposite. In this case, the biomarker of exposure to NNN, as it goes up, the odds ratio for getting esophageal cancer goes up. For lung cancer, it's below 1 in every case. So the exposure data indicates that there's a difference in the sites of cancer resulting from exposure to NNN and NNK. Since the proposed rule was focused on reducing esophageal or oral cancer, there is substantial support for limiting NNN, but there's not substantial support for limiting NNK. And FDA can't just say, well, we'll throw NNK in there just for fun, because when it gets to OMB or when it gets into the courts, this is the kind of thing that could throw the entire rule out and not have it in effect at all. So it's very important the scope of the rule be science supported. So findings led FDA in January of 2017 to issue a proposed rule requiring the mean level of nitrosamine NNN in any batch of smokeless tobacco products not to exceed 1 microgram per gram of tobacco on a dry weight basis at any time through the product's labeled expiration date as determined by specific product testing. Now, I just read language for the rule, but let me assure you that every single one of those words was argued at FDA as we were coming up with the standard, and specific aspects of that were argued over that long period. And the regulation was largely based on 4 things: the epidemiologic evidence of reduced esophageal cancer from smokeless tobacco in Sweden versus the United States, the availability of products that already meet the standard, the ability of other products that don't meet the standard to be able to be made to meet the standard, and the availability of analytical methods that can tell the difference. All those things have to be in place for this standard to be able to move forward. So in summary, every decision by FDA is subject to legal scrutiny and is limited by regulatory authority. The FDA reviews decisions involve a range of complex scientific and population health considerations, and FDA needs sound scientific research to support product standards. So that's why FDA is funding the TCORS. so that they can get the product standards they need to be able, or the science they need to support those review decisions and to support product standards. So I would be more than happy to answer any questions you guys might have.
Thank you, David. That was great. And I hope that we can refer to this in the future, especially with your permission, in our core competency class for TCORS, because I think this would really be helpful for everybody. Can we entertain some questions, please?
I have a question. This is Tess. Wonderful presentation, lots of detail. I've heard these things before, but they make much more sense now. I do continue to have questions about the term marketing. For example, on slide 18, you talk about marketing. And I'm wondering, does that mean the manufacturer simply trying to sell the product, or does that mean how they promote the product and persuade people?
Yeah, so when I'm afraid I kind of bounce back and forth. When I usually use the term marketing, I mean putting the product on the market. So making the product available to consumers. So through my talk, I probably have used marketing in that term a lot. In this case, in slide 18, it's actually has to do with the way the product is being promoted to consumers. So it has to do with advertising, promotion, labeling, and everything that's involved in trying to get people to use the product. So I probably go back and forth, and I probably should be better about being different between those terms. But so on slide 18, marketing has to do with promotion.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Other questions? Sam, do you have any questions? No? Adam?
Yeah, sure. I'll ask a question. Thanks, David. Great talk, and I appreciate your like service mission now as a an independent scientist to kind of continue to support us researchers to to advance regulatory science and public health. So, question for you is about the change in age laws. So, the federal law now is you have to be 21 to buy all tobacco products. And I think in terms of marketing, what we have surmised in the past is that some of the research that's really important is if it targets youth, because from what I understand, it's not illegal for the tobacco companies to sell their products and to try to market them and advertise them unless it somehow targets people who are underage. And so the question is, now that the age is 21, will FDA, do you think, find it useful to have data on whether the new marketing approaches disproportionately target and appeal to people who are aged 18, 19, and 20? And then I'll follow up with a kind of related question to that.
So the whole FDA actions against marketing is hard. It is very tough. There's no question that the law is very clear that the companies are not allowed to market to kids. And I think FDA is actually very interested in that age range, 18 to 21, but I don't think that's the priority right now. I think the whole idea of moving that age up to 21 really had to do with trying to get tobacco products out of high schools. So one of the problems we had is you had a lot of 18-year-olds who were seniors in high school who were selling their e-cigarettes to 16-year-olds. And there may still be some 21-year-olds in high school, but hopefully not many. And so I think a lot of that law, the impact of that law is going to be on trying to get tobacco use out of the high school so that the younger kids won't get it. So I think that's going to be the biggest impact of that. I don't think FDA is going to focus. I think if you propose to study looking at 19-year-olds, or 20-year-olds and marketing. I don't think FDA is going to be that interested in that. They're really more interested in 14 and 15 and 16-year-olds and to that, because it's easier. It's very tough for FDA to enforce anything around marketing, period, because of the First Amendment. So everything they try to do ends up being a First Amendment issue, and the level of scrutiny around First Amendment issue is huge. And so it's much easier for FDA to enforce something that's clearly for children or for young teenagers versus 18-year-olds. So I would focus my efforts still on kids, because FDA has a much better chance of actually enforcing that. Hopefully the law is going to help, take a lot of these tobacco products, e-cigarettes out of high schools, and that's going to help. It'll be very interesting when high schools really get back and going once we're through the COVID issue, if it's really going to have an impact or not.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And then like another question is about the population health standard, right? So one question is, how do you think the FDA interprets the population health standard? Is it like, and there's a specific kind of sub question about that. Is it really just, no matter the way you look at it, it's years life lost or some sort of like public health outcome? Maybe it includes, the economic social toll, and just the bottom dollar across various circumstances. Or I want to, an example here is, are youth treated differently? Because it is possible that some teens, right, are transitioning to e-cigarettes. Or does FDA just say, you know what we're going to do is, it's illegal if you're 17 or younger. I mean, obviously now it's 20, but let's just say, based on the previous question, if you're a minor, we interpret all tobacco product use as bad for public health. Is it applied that way or the former way?
I think
Does that question make sense?
Yeah, you broke up at a point there, which may have been a critical point, but let me try to answer, and then you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Your question where I'm not clear.
Yeah.
So FDA clearly focusing that kids should not be using tobacco products. They shouldn't be using e-cigarettes. They shouldn't be using cigarettes. They shouldn't be using cigars, period. And so there is no reason for that. And so in the equation for the appropriate protection of public health, there is no positive thing to kids using e-cigarettes or using cigarettes or any other tobacco product. So they don't really include in their calculation, e-cigarettes may help kids who are smoking cigarettes switch. That's not part of the calculation. It is around adults. So adults who are smoking cigarettes, calculation. And so they look at the whole issue around kids as kids should not be using these products. But I will tell you what has happened recently is the huge increase in e-cigarette use among kids. And that is kind of pushed the equation. It's adjusted the equation. My opinion, this is my opinion, and I've developed an opinion since I left FDA. So take it for what it's worth, is that any e-cigarette is going to have to, it's going to be authorized for staying on the market, is going to have to demonstrate how that e-cigarette, it does not appeal to kids. If they cannot demonstrate that, and if they don't provide evidence around that, I don't see FDA authorizing that for marketing. I actually published a paper in the last year, it was before COVID, so about that very issue, really trying to discuss the importance of the companies realizing they were going to have to address the kids issue above all. And if they didn't address that issue, I just don't see FDA authorizing that. So I think the issue is suddenly increased.
Yeah. All right. Sorry. And I don't want to hog it. This is my last question is, so when I was at SRNT, I ran into someone who works for PMI and was asking about their research about the effects of marketing on kids. And, I don't think I saw that in the initial MRT application. And they said, we can't do a study showing kids, our products. Do you imagine how that would be interpreted? We can't do that. So what is your thoughts about how the industry is going to get clear data with actual real youths on, appeal and marketing?
Yep. So the last SR&T I went to in New Orleans, I went to a session that was chaired by Suchitra Krishnan Saran from Yale. And the whole session was about how the industry should do studies on kids. And this is the whole session. And I went up to her afterwards and I said, Suchitra, you need to publish a paper on this issue, and you need to get together with the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids and publish a paper that explains how this can be done, because it needs to be done. And she published a paper. I don't know if you've seen that paper or not, but there is a paper that I can find it and send it to you. But they published a paper saying, here's how the industry should conduct research on kids, which they should be doing. And I liked it. I thought it was actually very well written. It was very well thought through. And so you have to get people like Suchitra, who is focused on kids. You have to get the people from the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids on the same side and saying, this is how it should be done. And they did that. So the industry likes to use that as an excuse. And they were using that as an excuse when I was there. And they will always use that as an excuse because they don't want to do those studies. They're afraid of doing those studies. They know that those studies, it's going to show that it's really attractive and appealing to kids, and they're going to be in trouble. So they like that excuse. That's why I tried to get some people to write a paper to beat that excuse down and to say, no, you can do those studies, and here's how you should do the studies. So I will send you that paper, Adam, and hopefully it can be followed up and take that excuse away from them.
Thank you.
Thank you. David, if you could send it to Emily, then she can distribute it to all of us.
Sure.
I have a question, and it pertains to something you said early on and was also shown on slides 16 and 35. And that was all about, it's actually used by consumers, the product. Now, one of the things that we have to be very careful of when we propose pilot projects, rapid response projects, or publish is sometimes we get a little bit of pushback from the FDA if we are measuring substances in addition to tobacco. So for example, if it's a tank device and we're interested in looking at what else teenagers or young adults put in that device besides tobacco. So we're somewhat restricted in that, and but your point bears on the realities that the FDA is supposed to be looking at a device is actually used by consumers. So do you have some concrete advice for us in terms of how we can keep measuring and how we phrase it to the FDA when we're taking a look at the use of devices for substances other than or in addition to tobacco? So THC from marijuana, alcohol use, anything else.
So FDA cannot fund studies related to marijuana. They can't do that. It's illegal. So that's just something they can't do. But if you notice in the PATH survey, there are a lot of questions about marijuana. FDA is funding that. That's not independent. So you have to phrase it in terms of what your primary interest is around tobacco, and that as an ancillary measurement, you're also going to be looking at marijuana because of its influence on tobacco use. So you have to bring everything back to tobacco use. You can't say, I'm interested in this because I'm interested in marijuana use. You have to say, I'm interested in this because it's tobacco use, and marijuana is often smoked together with tobacco. And so we have to understand the influence of marijuana on tobacco use. Now you can use however you want to once you get it, but that cannot be the focus or the aim of the product of the project, but it can be an ancillary measurement because of how it impacts tobacco use.
Yes, thank you. I think that's helpful to everyone. Heather, you have a question?
Thanks so much for your presentation. I'm going to push some questions to you that I get a lot and I have a hard time answering. So I wanted to return to the review process and kind of the lead up and follow up from the September deadline for the products that were in the market prior to 2016. So FDA had said that they would provide a list of the applications, but it doesn't appear that they've done that yet. And they haven't been publishing numbers of applications since I think June. And rumor has it that in the end, they received tens of millions of applications, which I just don't know how that may kind of impact the review process. And if you have any insight into what the current situation with review is and what timeline we're looking at for decisions to be made and for products to be like kind of resolved on.
Okay. Unfortunately, I'm not there anymore, so I can't answer some of those questions with good knowledge. It wouldn't surprise me at all if they haven't gotten tens of millions of applications. When I was there, the threat was that they would get those kind of applications. But the problem is for the industry, every single product has to have data that supports the marketing, the authorization of that product. So if I'm a company and I've got 1,000 products, that means I've got to do studies on 1,000 products. And if FDA doesn't get data on those products, I think they're going to reject those applications. They're just going to kick them out. They're going to say, you don't have data on project XYZ, and they're going to kick those things out. They're going to focus, I think, on a lot of the more prevalent products. They're going to focus on Jewel. They're going to focus on Blue, on Ego, on a lot of the products that have a bigger market share, and that where there's actually some data they can sink their teeth into. So, so I think that's what they're going to focus on. They're not going to get stuck on 10 million products because they realize they can't get stuck. If FDA gets stuck, the Tobacco Control Act will be overturned and won't exist anymore. And so they're going to have to make some decisions. And I think they will focus on the products that have the biggest impact, which are going to be Jewel and others. You asked a question about timeline, and that's a really hard question. And part of that is because a lot of that timeline is out of CTP's control. So for example, things like ICOS or Swedish snus, which I was heavily involved in when I was there, the science part of doing the Swedish snus review was about 6 months, and we were done. After 6 months, after opening the application, 6 months, we were done. And then it went to the lawyers, and it took another 1.5 years for the lawyers to decide what could and could not be said. And so very little of that, and actually whether it's substantial equivalence or anything else, very little of the time is time in the Center for Tobacco Products. More of the time is actually spent over in the Office of Chief Counsel, where they are debating the impact of that decision, not just on tobacco regulation, but on drug regulation and on food regulation, and because it has bigger implications. It's got wider implications. So I really can't help you with timeline. I think it's going to be shorter than what we've seen so far. I would expect before September of next year, there are going to be substantial number of decisions being made. And I think those decisions are going to be made about the products that are more commonly being used.
Can I make one just follow-up question that I, again, get a lot, and maybe in relation to the 2,000 plus rejections you've been mentioned have already taken place. What type of enforcement has been undertaken to remove the products from the marketplace, or what will be done for these products that they're going to be rejecting over the next year?
So I don't know what the numbers are right now, but there is a big part of FDA called the Office of Compliance. And their one job is to go out and to find out if these companies are doing what these companies are supposed to be doing. So they have inspectors that go out and are constantly looking for these products. Now, that process is also a legal process. So whenever you get into a legal situation, things are more drawn out than what you would hope. But they will go and they will start with letters. And so they'll send 2 or 3 letters to the company saying, take it off. Then they'll go to, I've forgotten the word, cash. They'll start taking, they make them pay money. For a lot of the companies, that's fine. That's just part of doing business. But when it really gets down to it and you have no marketing orders, that's when it really makes a difference. When you say to a mom and pop shop, you can no longer sell tobacco, you know, a filling station or a convenience store, you can no longer sell tobacco. That is a big deal because that's where they make most of their money, is selling tobacco. And so then they wise up. But it is a long process for every single product. And FDA has a very active group who does that and works very hard at it. So they enforce it. It's just not as quick as a lot of us would like it to be.
Thank you. That's great. Thanks.
But you can go on the FDA website and they've got a list of all those enforcement actions. And there are probably 100,000. Before CTP started, the number of enforcement actions at FDA was probably numbered 10 or 12. And then now CTP has probably done 100,000, which the culture of FDA was 2 things. Number one, we don't enforce anything and we never say no to a company. And CTP has kind of turned that whole thing over. As soon as CTP started saying no to the companies, the lawyers went through the roof. What do you mean you're saying no? Well, how can you do that? We don't know how to deal with that. But CTP insisted that no was a good answer.
Tess, I have a quick a question that you were talking about before you started, which was about IQOS, and you're thinking that IQOS was not really intended for the U.S. market, that the PMTA approval was really a way to help market it overseas.
Yep.
Could you say more about that? And I see Josh also wanted to ask a question. I'm hoping this will help Josh in his investigation of IQOS.
Yeah, well, the reality is most people in the United States are not going to like IQOS. They're just not going to like it. It's a crummy product. It's an awful product. If you're a cigarette smoker, it's terrible. I mean, you just don't want to use it. If you're an e-cigarette smoker, maybe it's a little bit better, but it's crummy. It's a terrible product. It's a pain in the butt to use. I mean, you've got to clean it. You've got to, hold it for 30 seconds, waiting for the thing to heat up. It's just not a desirable product. So I don't see it really taking off in the United States. It may, and we need to keep an eye on it. And if it does, we need to know that. But I just don't see it happening in the United States. In other parts of the world, yeah, it is happening, and it's happening big. And those are parts of the world like Japan, where you cannot get nicotine e-cigarettes, where there's no other alternative. In Japan, where their culture is to not offend their neighbor. In the United States, we've now got this cool thing where we're just offending our neighbors all the time now. But in Japan, you just don't do that. And so they've got to have some alternative if they want to smoke. And so this is a great alternative. They can smoke because they can't get nicotine e-cigarettes. This is a great way. So it's going to take off there. And they're going to use that. Matter of fact, it's appearing already around the world that this product was authorized or deemed to be safe by the US FDA, which is not true, but they're using that as their marketing all over the world now.
Thank you.
Thanks for the alley-oop there, Tess. If I could just jump in and ask a quick question about some stuff that has kind of been brought up on slide 16, where you're talking about actual use. So if we circle back to IQOS, like their marketing within the US now allows them to like cite available evidence to date because they got that exposure modification order, right? So they can say, among other things, that scientific studies have shown that switching completely from conventional cigarettes to the IQOS system significantly reduces body exposure to yada, yada, yada. You mentioned that if significant evidence were to show, as that Korean study showed, that like the majority of people, the vast majority of people that are using IQOS are using it in conjunction with other tobacco products, would that then be taken from their ability to use it as a marketing standpoint? Because
absolutely. You need evidence on that. You need evidence that people are dual using it, and particularly dual using it long time. It's not a transition product. It's not a product that take you from smoking to using it exclusively, but dual use is a long-term event. That's really, really important. You need to know, are kids picking this thing up? If kids are picking this thing up, it is gone. There is no way it's going to stay on the market. So those are really important things. And the other thing we really need is some good data on dual use to show that with dual use, people are not getting a lot of reduction in biomarkers, that they're still being exposed to high levels. Those are all really critical things which would make a huge difference in whether FDA, number one, allows it to stay on the market, and number two, allows it to make those claims.
A brief follow-up. So one of the things that FDA is able to do is like limit both explicit and implicit mentions that a tobacco product may not be harmful to individuals. If we are allowing all of these like ends or alternative tobacco products to mention that if they were to switch completely, that you would have limited exposure to certain chemicals within combustible cigarettes, can't that be construed, if dual use is really the most likely outcome, as more of an implicit health statement by that organization saying, if you're to switch completely, well, nobody's actually switching completely, but what it might actually be doing is creating like a false sense of health by individuals saying, well, it must be healthier than cigarettes.
I think that'd be a very good research project to take people and particularly users, if you can get them, but you probably may not be able to find enough users, but take people and have them read that statement and then determine whether they think, if I just decrease the amount of cigarettes and start using some of this, then I'll be much safer. In evaluating that, I think that's a really important question that needs to be answered.
All right, thank you so much.
You know, Philip Morris has presented data to FDA saying that that wasn't the case, that people understood clearly that it was just under exclusive use, but there needs to be independent data on that very question.
We're doing, I think that's a great question that you raised, Josh, and I wanted to follow up on that, David. So we've been exploring some potential differences between dual use, which is 2 products, versus polyuse, we're defining 3 or more. Sam Salina had who's one of our trainees, had a pilot project, and we're finding in that and at least 2 other publications so far that there is a real cutoff that polyuse is more dangerous in terms of addiction liability than dual use. We have a subcommittee through CASEL right now that's just combined its measurement and analytics group to really dig deeply into this and develop standards for measurement that we then analyze for each one. But my question is, I think what we could also use in research, and you addressed some of this to Josh, is I think we need a lot of new research on reported reasons for patterns of use. So Sam's got part of her pilot project. We haven't finished analyzing the data yet on self-reported reasons for types of use. So for example, we might make an assumption like you just stated, for example, that someone might be in a dual use type of pattern because they think that if they smoke e-cigarettes for part of the time and conventional cigarettes for the rest of the time, that they're a little bit safer. But in our country, I don't know if we have enough information on that yet, nor do we have it by age group. So we don't know if they're simply experimenting, if it has something to do with what is immediately accessible within any 1 hour of a day, or whether or not it has somewhat to do with the types of social groups that they're involved in. Oh, I happen to be at a party and nobody's smoking conventional cigarettes, but they are vaping. So they use that. Can you speak to that point a little bit more in terms of what you think would be very valuable to the FDA in terms of exploring reasons for these different patterns of dual and poly use, how they can use that?
Yeah, I think what you've talked about are really good. So FDA obviously cannot regulate people's behavior. That's not what they're doing, but they can regulate the products and they can regulate the characteristics of the products. So to me, what you really should be interested in is what characteristics of the products influence people's use behavior. So here's an example. So if I've got a cigarette, an e-cigarette, and it can last me half the day, and then I smoke cigarettes the other half the day because I don't have time to recharge my e-cigarette, that's a bad e-cigarette versus an e-cigarette that lasts me all day long and I don't naturally have a time where I go to start smoking regular cigarettes. So particular characteristics may actually influence dual use or poly use. The delivery of nicotine may influence poly use. So one of the questions, and FDA can regulate characteristics. So if they're weighing whether to authorize two products and one will actually encourage people to become exclusive users of e-cigarettes, the other encourages people to become dual users, that's gonna change their calculus about what products they're gonna authorize and which ones they're not. But the more it can focus on the characteristics of the product and not the people's feelings and thoughts, and it's better, because FDA can regulate what products are out there and they really can't regulate people's behavior.
Right.
So the more you can get on characteristics and the less on this one tastes good. There is some taste because there's flavor and things like that, but focus on characteristics and not on the other side.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
That's very helpful for us, all of us. I think, do we have any more questions? Because if not, I want to give David just a few minutes. He has another meeting starting at 11. We have several meetings. Anybody have a last question? A quick one? Okay, then. Oh, Josh, you have one? Quick? No, you're clapping. Thank you. Thank you, David. I'll talk to you in a few minutes.
Okay, it was
Everybody.
fun.
This was great. Thanks.
All right, thank you.